We all appreciate that matzah has a tremendous spiritual significance, but did you ever consider that egg matzah also has spiritual significance? And in fact, the distinction between ordinary matzah and flavored or enhanced or egg matzah represents two different states of spiritual development, one which was dominant at the time of Pesach, one which will be dominant at the time of Mashiach. So when we get zum Tziva, when the pasuk tells us, the Parshas Boy, that you should eat matzah on this night, the night obviously that was going to become Pesach, as in the Nacht von Tezvav Nisan, Zeindig noch Mitzrayim, the 15th of Nisan, when the Jews were still in Egypt, haben ihnen gedarfen essen matzah, they had to eat matzah. Gefällt mir advar pele. We find something very strange when you actually analyze this pasuk and compare it to the other pasuk about matzah, which is later in Parshas Re'eh. So it seems that there's something very intriguing. Because by the Mitzvah Achilas Matzah L'Doros, when we're told that throughout history we'll always have to eat matzah on Pesach, that's something which happens in Parashas Re'eh. Zokti Torah, there the Torah says, Shivas Yomim Teichal Olav, for 7 days you should eat matzos, lechem oini, matzahs which have to be the poor man's bread. And the reason is, because you left Egypt in a frenzy, in a hurry. It's from that pasuk in Parashas Re'eh that we learn as the matzah muzayin lechem oini dafka, that in order to qualify as matzah, the matzah has to be lechem oini specifically, which means only flour and water. Nike matzah shira, it cannot be what we call wealthy or rich matzah, which is matzah that has other ingredients as well. Now, when you consider that that's in Parashas Re'eh, but when we're told about the original Pesach that the Jews ate when they were in Mitzrayim, in our Parasha Boy, but Parasha Seinu, it doesn't mention anything about the poor man's bread, is masha. That seems to imply as it does give the impression that on that night prior to the Exodus, when the Jews were told to eat matzah, they could technically have fulfilled that mitzvah by eating matzah that had other ingredients like egg or juice or wine or whatever added to it. That's quite interesting, right? We never knew that, right? So that implies that even though at our Pesach Seder today, throughout history, our Pesach matzah has to be just flour and water, dafka, is that by Golas Mitzrayim Gufa given an order to Eichfar matzah ashira. Somehow at the time of the original Exodus, there was the option of a different kind of matzah that had more flavor. But even then, Nit based the Yetzia fun Mitzrayim, they were not allowed to eat the matzah ashira once they were leaving or had left Mitzrayim. From Dan haben ihnen gegessen because everybody knows that at that point they only ate basic matzah, which was the poor man's bread. Now, far the Yetzia and al sachona dertzu, if anything, the Torah allows them the opportunity to eat this enhanced matzah prior to the Exodus from Egypt and possibly as a preparation to leave Egypt. So we need to understand what all that means, and especially when we consider that Pesach is not just a once upon a time story, but it's something that is relevant in our lives, and therefore matzah has relevance right across the spiritual experience of the Jewish people throughout history. So Pesach Mitzrayim is the Mokav Sherish of Pesach or Matzah Shel Hadoros. Obviously, it goes without saying that the original Pesach, when the Jews were in Mitzrayim, is the root of all the Pesachs that are celebrated throughout history, and therefore the matzah that was present at that time must have an impact on the matzah that we have throughout history as well. So therefore, is more we can understand as the Inyan Hanal ba Pesach Mitzrayim, this concept we've just quoted about Pesach Mitzrayim, which came as a bit of a surprise to us, as Al Sachonot Tzu Yetzias Mitzrayim is done in Sinas Mokim of Matzah Ashira, where we've now learned that in preparation to leave Egypt, there was the possibility of having so-called egg matzah. So there's got to be something about our annual Pesach celebration that is also similar to that, and we've got to work out what that is. So we'll look at the commentary on the Mordechai on the Gemara Pesachim, and he says something in the halachic context that's really fascinating. Steht in Mordechai, as Vizman, Beis Hamikdash Kayom, he says in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, Hayoisen Kol HaSeder Achar HaSuda, they would first eat the meal, and then they would do the Pesach Seder. Very different to how we do it, right? And they would actually only eat the matzah for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah after they had actually eaten regular food beforehand. Completely different to how we do it today. Not only that, later on in the Masechta, the Mordechai tells us, in the meal that they had prior to the Seder on Pesach night, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they actually used to eat matzah that had other ingredients as well. And the reason for that is Gedeas, the Brichas HaMoitzi, von der Seuda, soll nicht sein, if a matzah mit welchem evet später beim Seder, mekayim sein mitzvah achilas matzah. They actually wanted to make a distinction, that when they would say the Bracha HaMoitzi lechem in Aretz, it would be on one kind of bread, one kind of matzah, that would be distinct from a different kind of matzah, which would be reserved purely and only for the mitzvah that would happen later on in the night. So that's quite fascinating, that the Mordechai argues that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they actually used to have flavored or matzah with extra ingredients at their Pesach table before they started the formal Seder. Now obviously we don't do that nowadays, but we do have something halachically that would create a similar experience for us, even though we don't necessarily do this in practice, but we're allowed to do it. Of course, in our lives today, we do the whole Seder first, and then we have the meal, which is the exact opposite of how the Mordechai describes it. But besides that, the din is practically, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, even in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, as Erev Pesach Kodim Shoah series, that Erev Pesach in the early morning, before the time that we're not allowed to eat chametz anymore, Hagam etonitesem kematzah. We know that you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. Zabumuta lechol matzah shira, but you would be allowed to eat egg matzah or something similar matzah that has various other ingredients, which is quite interesting. Shlomo as dos gufa v'Shulchan Aruch Torah is matir lechatchila bepashtus etzem matzah shira. Now, of course, the fact that you have a ruling in Shulchan Aruch that allows you to eat that kind of matzah, this matzah shira, in the morning of Erev Pesach, that tells you something. Ba'avayis as Erev Pesach, that's telling us that on Erev Pesach, which is obviously the time that we're preparing for the Exodus, we're preparing for the commemoration of the Exodus, then halacha obviously allows the possibility of matzah shira, matzah that has additional ingredients earlier on before Pesach. So it fits the theme. Just like before the Jews left Egypt, they could eat matzah shira. So before Pesach actually comes in, at the time of Bir Chometz, or a little bit later, we're allowed to have matzah shira as well. Really interesting, right? Now, why is it that we today are supposed to at our Pesach Seder specifically eat lechem oini, which is only flour and water? Is the pasuk masvidem time hatzivoy? The pasuk actually gives us a reason in Parshas Rei, where it says ki b'chipozin yatzosem eretz Mitzrayim, because the Jews rushed out of Egypt, and then of course, as we know, they didn't have an opportunity for the dough to rise. Of a melech hisvik batzik lahachmitz. Of a baldas lechem oini is sholil nit nor chometz. Now, the description of lechem oini is not only matzah versus leavened bread, nor oich matzah shira kanal. Actually, lechem oini also excludes the possibility of a kind of matzah that has additional ingredients. Is mistaveras ki b'chipozin yotzos gomer. So if that's the logic, lechem oini also excludes matzah shira, and the reason for lechem oini is because of the rush to leave Egypt. So then whatever that frenzied haste to leave Egypt was all about is also an explanation why at the Seder we're not allowed to have matzah that has additional ingredients. So we're going to lock the two together. In that case, we have to understand, what about the fact that they rushed out of Egypt? Is that time, if there was matzah would be a reason why you cannot fulfill the obligation of eating matzah at the Pesach night with matzah that has additional ingredients. Okay, now in order to understand it, we're going to take the same pasuk and we're going to learn another halacha out of this pasuk as well. And when we have the two halachas together, it will help us to understand what about rushing out of Egypt is tied in specifically to lechem oini, to the exclusion of matzah shira. So what else do we learn from this pasuk? From demselben pasuk hanal the same pasuk, just a little bit earlier in the pasuk, that says lo yiseichal alav chometz. You're not allowed to eat chometz, obviously together with your matzah. Shivas yom teichal alav matzahs gomer, and you're not, and for 7 days you only eat matzahs. So from that, we learned up as the halacha is that the only ingredients that are acceptable to produce matzah are ingredients that under different circumstances would become chometz. In other words, the only reason it's not becoming chometz is because we're very cautious to do it within 18 minutes and make sure we're working the dough, etc. Okay, so now we have two things we've learned from this pasuk. The first one is that it has to be lechem oini, poor man's bread, only flour and water. The second thing is that matzah would never qualify as matzah if it could not have the potential to become chometz. On the shayches v'tam fun ki b'chipozin gomer ivdem. Now you're going to ask, so what's the link between rushing out of Mitzrayim and the principle that it had to be possible for the ingredients to become chometz? Well, that's quite logical. Kemen zogen bepashtus v'bald as b'pesach Mitzrayim is given a botzik v'sot gekent v'en chometz. Because when the Jews left Egypt, what kind of dough were they carrying in their bags? Dough that could have become chometz. The only reason it didn't become chometz is because of circumstances of the hurry. Darf euch die Matzah, was messt als Zeichen Yetzias Mitzrayim sein von Dvorim haboim lidei chimutz. Well, if the dough they had leaving Egypt could have become leaven, then the matzah we have on Pesach to commemorate leaving Egypt also has to have the potential to become chametz. And therefore, and then it's our job to make sure it doesn't become chametz. We have to protect the ingredients from rising. Remembering, commemorating Yetzias Mitzrayim. Just like when the Jews rushed out of Egypt and their dough couldn't rise, we have to be proactive to make sure that our dough does not rise. So now we have two things that are both derived from the same source. And Yos has debated in these two halachas. Number one, matzah shira, that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah at Pesach if you have matzah which has additional ingredients. And secondly, based that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of matzah if the ingredients could never become chametz in the first place. Zok the pasuk demselben tam are both presented in the pasuk for the same reason, which is because the Jews rushed out of Egypt. That illustrates to us that these two kinds of matzah with additional ingredients, or matzah without yeast or anything else that would allow it to rise, they must both have the same, if not a very similar, reason why they're not good enough to be the matzah that we use on Pesach. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to have to explore, what it is about these two factors that disqualify them from being acceptable matzahs and what they have in common on the one hand. And on the other hand, we find, as we did mention, the first time we're actually taught about the concept that you could theoretically have matzah shira, matzah with additional ingredients, or at least they did have at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. That we're only told much later on in Parashas Re'eh. Truth is that even when the Jews were celebrating Pesach in anticipation of leaving Egypt, there was already the broader rule as the matzah von Leil Pesach mozayin von azar botzek vos yichel lavoi lidei chimutz, that even though they were not yet told that you can only have flour and water, no other ingredients, they were clearly, obviously told that what they're going to use for matzah must be a dough that ordinarily could rise. How do we know that? When we learn this up in Yerushalmi from Pasuk, the Yerushalmi illustrates it to us in the Pasuk that is told to the Jewish people while they are still in Mitzrayim, that they have to guard the matzahs. As from that the Yerushalmi learns, well, the fact that they had to guard the matzahs, which means to protect them from turning into leaven, so that indicates that in order to fulfill the mitzvah, they had to have matzah that could have become leaven. Fascinating concept, even though we have two very closely linked halachas, they don't necessarily apply together when the Jews were leaving Egypt, because the Pesach Mitzrayim, they could have matzah shira with additional ingredients. Nevertheless, at the same time, that matzah had to be protected from rising. Let's say, for example, the matzah had been made with flour and fruit juice, and now you add water to that fruit juice, which allows the possibility of fermentation and therefore of rising. The dough could potentially rise. The truth is, when you have that concoction of wine or oil or fruit juice or whatever it is, together with water, it will ferment quicker and it will rise quicker. So it's quite intriguing that before the Jews left Mitzrayim, the matzah that they had could include other ingredients, but it would be disqualified unless it also had water, which would allow it the potential to rise. So what do all of these things mean? Well, in order to appreciate them, we're going to have to go a little bit deeper and look at these things from a spiritual perspective. To understand this from a spiritual perspective, we'll have to understand and appreciate what is the difference between poor man's matzah, just flour and water, and rich matzah, which has other ingredients in spiritual terms or in our service of Hashem. So lechem oini, let's start off with the poor man's bread. Is von ateig was hot blois kemachol mayim. It's made out of dough that is purely comprised of water and flour. That's it. Was mayim abnita ungibenik in tam. We know very well that water doesn't have it or contribute a taste to a product, to a food. And matzah shira, on the other hand, is von arisa was geknoten mit yain, shem and dvash. Whereas the so-called rich matzah is kneaded together with other materials that will add flavor, oil, wine, honey, or the andere pears, fruit juice, was given a time in their isa. They obviously will add flavor to the dough, and therefore they will add flavor to the matzah. So what do these two things represent? Dough with flavor, dough without flavor. The union in avodah, what that represents in our service of Hashem is that lechem oini is the avodah from kabbalas oil. The poor man's bread, that represents when we serve Hashem out of absolute dedication. Nit mitzad geschmack, not because we enjoy it, but because it is our responsibility. Even if the person does not have a rational explanation that satisfies them as to why they should do these things. And therefore, because the person doesn't have a rational appreciation for it, they don't have a personal enjoyment in this particular mitzvah, because we tend to enjoy things that we appreciate. So nevertheless, the person will still dedicate themselves to do what the Eibishter wants out of acceptance of Hashem's authority. That is lechem oini. On the other hand, matzah ashira, a beautiful, tasty matzah, that is the avodah mitzvah tam v'das. That represents when we serve Hashem because we have a clear, healthy, grounded appreciation, intellectual appreciation of what Hashem wants from us and why it is important. Then it's in the same way as the dough has flavor, our avodas Hashem has pleasure. It's enjoyable, it's appreciated, it's pleasurable because we get it, we understand, and we resonate with it. So now, b'shas the avodah from Eden is no mitzad kabbalah soil. When a person serves Hashem purely out of dedication, on the time for seichel u'midas, without that added value of truly understanding and personally appreciating what they're doing and why it's important, is doch in a matziv as mitzad seichel u'midas is bayim do anort if nit tanazay. So okay, let's work it out. If my mind that hasn't yet comprehended why I should do this, and my feelings are not invested in doing it, then the fact that I'm doing it means I'm going through the responsibilities that I have out of dedication to Hashem, but I don't know, my head could argue against it, and one day I could feel differently, and therefore there's the possibility of there's the possibility of actually moving astray at some point. But the only thing is, because the person is so dedicated, they quell any interest in perhaps doing something different or any distraction, and they just motor on and do what Hashem expects. That's how Kabbalah's all works. It's not very exciting, but it's very reliable. But when a person masters their understanding of and a mature feeling towards their avodah, then I don't just need to bring in the heavy guns to make sure that I'm dedicated to doing what Hashem wants, even if my mind has questions and I don't necessarily feel like it, because now my mind doesn't have questions and I actually do feel like it. So I've completely removed the possibility of distraction or going astray or letting myself down. So there is no bad left. That is what we call ishapcha. Okay, so the lechem oini represents Kabbalah soul, which is the avodah of iskafia, overcoming our tendency to do something which is inappropriate, versus matzah ashira, which is we're in a good, healthy, tasty, enjoyable place because even our mind and our heart is aligned with what Hashem wants, and therefore there's no possibility, no room for error. On dos is the keshet zwischen die zwei sugei matzah. That is the link between these two kinds of matzah. On the one hand, out of matzah ashira, the possibility of matzah having other ingredients, and based on dvarim she'ein boim lidei chimutz, and the fact that matzah has to have the potential to become chometz versus a dough that could never become chometz. But the truth is, in a spiritual sense, matzah ashira and matzah that cannot rise is linked. Why is that? Let's say that a person has mastered the matzah ashira way of serving Hashem, which is that my mind is completely on board and that my feelings are completely aligned. That doesn't allow the possibility of negative, in the same way as you could have a dough that doesn't allow the possibility of rising, of chometz. In fact, that is the reality of classic matzah ashira. It doesn't have water in it, so it's not inclined to rise. When a person is so engaged with their dedication to Hashem, there is no scope for any kind of virus, for any kind of infection of inappropriate thoughts. Specifically though, when a person is serving the Eibishter because I'm doing what I'm supposed to, I'm not yet there, I'm not yet holding at that level, I'm not yet aligned with these things, I'm just doing what the Eibishter wants. That's where there is the possibility, well, things could possibly go awry and possibly, some chometz could creep in, which is what we've defined, the possibility of bali dei chimutz. But what we do is we break it down, we hold it down, we don't allow it to express itself. In the same way as you guard the matzahs to make sure no chometz happens to the matzahs, we guard ourselves to make sure that no inappropriate thoughts or behaviors creep into our lives. So now, we've distinguished two ways of serving the Eibishter, which is Kabbalah Sol on its own, always at risk of my mind going elsewhere because I haven't mastered my mind yet, versus Avodah Mitzad Seichel and Midas, which is that I'm really grounded and fully invested, and so there's no possibility for invasion from the outside. Lechem Oini versus Matzah Ashira. We're now going to align those with the Geula from Mitzrayim versus the Geula of Mashiach. Die zwei feine Avodah sollen sich heraus bichlolo seichen die zwei feinen Klolim von Geula. So these two types of avodah, they relate to the two types of geula that will happen: geulas Mitzrayim, the original exodus from Egypt, and geula hoasida, and the geula that will happen in the future with Mashiach. By Yetzias Mitzrayim state, we know very well, the Torah tells us at the time that the Jews left Mitzrayim, it was kiborach ha'am. They had to run for their lives, chipazon. There was a frenzy. Why? Because as the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, because in addition to the fact that there was an Egypt they were living in, there was also an internal negativity that was so powerful that they had to run. If they would have stayed longer, they would have been swallowed up. When there's still internal negativity to deal with, then you've got to run away from negative influences as quickly as you can, because you're susceptible to those influences, to the impurities of Mitzrayim. That's exactly how we have described the so-called poor man's bread, the avodah von eskafe, where a person overcomes their tendencies even though they have those tendencies. And that's why they have to work so hard with Kabbalah Sol to prevent themselves from being susceptible to their tendencies. Whereas when Mashiach comes, as the Novi Yeshaya tells us, there will be no hurry to leave Golus. It's why? Because the Eibishter will eradicate any impurities from the world. So there's nothing to be susceptible to. That's a matzah punisapka. That's a world where the negative has been totally transformed, where the dark has become light. That's like matzah ashira. That is much more like the matzah that has all the ingredients, that it's an enjoyable experience. You're not just on guard all the time, on high alert. That's why the pasuk in Re'eh that reminds us that the Jewish people left Mitzrayim in a big rush is that time for was the matzah from the Pesach matzah ashira is the explanation why you're not allowed to have matzah with additional ingredients at the Pesach Seder. And why you cannot use a dough that would never have risen in the first place. Because we're describing and commemorating on Pesach the rush to get away from bad influences, because we're vulnerable, because we still have the negative within ourselves that hasn't been eradicated. That reminds us that we're still in the phase where the way that we serve Hashem has to be with absolute commitment and acceptance of Hashem's authority, and iskafia, quelling the negative impulses that we have. Lechem oini dafka, where we have to use specifically the poor man's bread. Now, das was mis Pesach nit yotze mit matzah ashira, despite the fact that before the Yidden left Mitzrayim at their original Pesach Seder, they could have matzah ashira, we cannot. It's not It's not just because, well, the nature of Geulas Mitzrayim was very much about iskafia and Kabbalah Sol, which is represented by lechem oini, so therefore matzah ashira is out of place. Because we're commemorating rushing and running Kabbalah Sol iskafia canal, where we have to accept Hashem's authority and make sure we overpower our negative influences. But there's something much more profound over here. Lechem oini, and by extension, the principle of Yetzias Mitzrayim, has a certain advantage even over Matzah Ashira and even over the future redemption of Mashiach. What's the big advantage? Well, of course, the great thing about Ishapcha is you completely eradicate the negative. It's gone, it's no longer a threat. But there is still an advantage when you're fighting against and overcoming the negative. What is that advantage? Because Iskafia highlights human endeavor. The fact that the person is fighting and neutralizing the negative, the enemy within himself. And that's worth a lot. Human endeavor is ultimately the purpose for creation. So Ishapcha takes you higher, but Iskafia is more valuable in a sense. In an undersignal, to put it differently, when a person attains the level of Ishapcha, what it effectively means is that person has become completely united with Hashem, durch dem, was sich mezakech, bis as lasniken ort ifra. Which means basically that the person has elevated and refined themselves to such a point that they are immune to negative influences. In Eskafia, the bittul und avekleg tzelikus. So Ishapcha tells me I've kind of meshed with Hashem. Whereas Iskafia says, I am putting myself aside, I'm working against myself for Hashem. Because even though I have the potential in my mind, in my feelings, to be exposed to negativity, I push against that. And I work with myself to do something that is against my nature and is mekayim dem ratzon elin, to fulfill what the Eibishter wants. That is incredibly powerful. I'm not just taken for a ride because I'm plugged in. I'm actually working hard and fighting a very, let's be honest, a very difficult fight to succeed. Das ist einer von den Bionen, was euch bei der Gula Hasidah wird sein, der Secher von Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's one of the reasons why, as we said, the Pesach say that Agada, based on the Mishnah, that even in the time of Mashiach, we'll still have a mitzvah to recall Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why? Why is that still relevant? At the time of Ishapcha, everything's been transformed. Why are you still talking about the kind of avodah that you had where you were fighting against the negative? Because the ultimate objective is to have the value of both. Ishapcha takes us higher and Iskafia takes us deeper, and the ultimate state is to have both advantages. Even when we have progressed so far that we're at a stage of transforming the negative to positive, completely immunizing ourselves against inappropriate influences, where the person has refined themselves to the extreme, so much so that there's no chance of anything negative creeping in, even in that state and that stage, we also have to have and still celebrate the greatness of Iskafia, of overcoming our negativity. Geulas Mitzrayim, represented by the Gula from Mitzrayim. The bittul from the modern, which is really about bittul, about the person suspending their own interests and being completely surrendered to Hashem and therefore working really hard. So even in the time of Mashiach, where there isn't the same need for that hard work and there isn't that same need for that bittul, it's still a value to have and to achieve. Now, the Alter Rebbe is Masben Torah. That's why we speak about Geulas Mitzrayim even at the time of Mashiach. Now, on the other extreme, the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah, as das versteht by Geulas Mitzrayim, the fact that the Eibishter's promise about Yetzias Mitzrayim, he says, V'anochi a'alcho gam aloi tzvei aliyos. The Eibishter says twice that he will elevate, in one statement, that he will elevate and take us out of Mitzrayim. Meint das euch die zweite Aliyah, was wird sein bei Gula Hasidus. So the Alter Rebbe explains that even though there the Eibush is talking about the Geula from Mitzrayim, he's already alluding to the Geula of Mashiach because it's embedded in the Geula from Mitzrayim as well. So in the same way as when Mashiach comes, we'll still have an element of Geulas Mitzrayim that we commemorate and that we engage in our service of Hashem. Equally, before they even left Mitzrayim, there's already an inkling of Geula of Mashiach. B'meila Movan, that helps us to understand. As Punkt für dienen von Geulas Mitzrayim wird man der Monen, wird wirken by the Geula Hasidah, as we've just mentioned. We'll still commemorate the Geula from Mitzrayim when Mashiach comes because we'll still have a role to play. The same applies the other way. By Geulas Mitzrayim, that even when you're just at the point of trying to get out of Mitzrayim, you already have to feel and sense and experience the Eibishter's promise of, and therefore, the Geula that will happen in the time of Mashiach. Now, what does that actually mean? How is it possible? Let's be practical. Let's talk about ourselves. How is it possible that we should have that kind of impact on ourselves? That even when we're in a stage of our development that we feel we have so much negative that is so out of control inside of our bodies, inside of our minds, inside of our hearts. And even when we overcome an element of that negativity, still, it's still there. which is sometimes one of the most frustrating and disheartening elements of avodah. We work, we have a success, and a few months later, we collapse again. Like in the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The gates have been broken open, you have a way out of Mitzrayim, but you still have to run because you've got the Mitzrayim within yourself. So how is it possible in that state? How are we ever going to overcome the negative? Where are we going to find the strength for this? Where are we going to find the resources? We're battling. Is Messiah, so to have the recognition and awareness that there will come a time, there will be a tipping point where all of those battles that we have fought will eventually culminate in a complete removal and transformation of the negative. That's what motivates us to keep going. Today I don't feel it, tomorrow I may not feel it, but there will be a time where I'll feel it. And that's why even before Geulas Mitzrayim happens, actually for that matter, even before Golus Mitzrayim happens, is already talking about a double elevation. Is already talking about a futuristic redemption of Hisapcha, of complete immunity to negative, where you no longer have these struggles because you need to know before you start that that's where you can and will land up. Now the fact that we are conscious of the time of Mashiach and we mention and speak about it even when we're commemorating Geulas Mitzrayim, it's not just because we're wistful and we say, well, one day in the future that's going to happen. It's also an access point, a portal to be able to bring that experience into our here and now. As gleich b'tchilas ha'avodah Golus Mitzrayim, and when we're very, very early on in our spiritual development, when we're still, so to speak, in Golus, we could already have a sample of what Mashiach life is going to be like. Now the Chelek you can ask the question, we're right at the beginning of our spiritual development, which means that all the negativity inside of ourselves is as strong as ever. How could we even have a taste, a sampling, a whiff of a futuristic state where there's none of those challenges? Where we've completely converted everything. It sounds so beyond us, so far-fetched. It's a bit in them. So there's an explanation. The reality is, yes, when we're early on in our spiritual development, it's not within range that we could completely neutralize and cancel the negativity in our lives. That's why we have to fight, and that's why we have to accept Hashem's authority, because we're not ready to do this on our own steam. But the fascinating thing is to say, I will surrender myself to Hashem, and I will only do what the Eibishter wants, does not have to feel like a load. The fact that we're being bottled, that we're surrendering to Hashem, should become something we own, something we feel as ours. Which means that even our mind, that even our heart should acknowledge that Kabbalah Soul is the correct place and a useful and a healthy and wholesome place to be. Which means that you can have this ironic situation where a person is completely dedicated to Hashem with absolute surrender and commitment, and yet has a tremendous pleasure from it. That's the goal. Das heißt, dass die Geula Hasidah should be Geulas Mitzrayim. In other words, when we speak about the notion of a future Geula, when we're still dealing with the Exodus from Egypt, is nicht der Avodah von Seichel Midas bifnei atzmam. We're not talking about getting to the point eventually where we master our minds and our hearts. Was bringt sof zu Isabcha Kanal Sifei, which we already said before, will bring us to the point of totally immunizing against negative. It's not only that. It's actually part of how we're serving the Eibishter right now. As the avodah from Kabbalah Soul is miteich tainuk, that we should be embracing and enjoying the fact that we have the opportunity to dedicate ourselves to Hashem, even when it's difficult. That we celebrate the fact that we're fighting these battles. And by the way, in a similar vein, in the future, when Mashiach comes and we still we still commemorate and speak about the Yetzias Mitzrayim, is as a prat in the Geula Hasidah. It's not just nostalgic; it will actually be a detail of what that experience of Geula will be like in the time of Mashiach. The Ikra Yasid is Zikuch Metzias Adam Isapcha. As we've mentioned, the ultimate achievement of the time of Mashiach is Isapcha, complete elevation and refinement of the person, and therefore complete immunization against anything negative. Now the Zikuch wird sein nicht modudu mugbel bloise if so viel wie viel mitzad sein Metzias is sich mezakech. But here's the great thing. If it was just about me, the individual, refining myself, well, I'm a limited being, and even with all the refinement in the world, I'm still going to be a limited being. Now, but what's going to happen is, even in that state, I will have access to this supercharged version of growth and development, just like a person who's bottle. It's not about me. It's no longer about me. It's about what the Eibishter wants from me. And that's the greatness. Even in the time of Mashiach, when we, so to speak, reach a sense of personal perfection, we actually won't be limited just to what our personal perfection can achieve. We'll have the Maila of Bittul, which takes us completely beyond. So now we can understand why it is that the matzah the Jewish people ate on the night of the eve of Pesach before leaving Mitzrayim was matzah shira. On the one hand. But yet on the other hand, and yet it had to be a dough that could theoretically have become chometz, which does seem a little contradictory, because by rights matzah shira is not susceptible to be chometz. Why is that? So the eskalus von Geula Hasidah in Geulas Mitzrayim, because we understand now that there is an incorporation of the experience of the future redemption in the Pesach redemption, is do'anot for matzah shira in Mitzrayim. There's a possibility of having matzah shira, which is a taste of Mashiach, while you're still in Egypt. Aber das, was in Mitzrayim kann sein, am Ende liyosid, is not in dem Prat von Ashira. But how much taste of the future can we have? Only the satisfaction, the pleasure of the future. That we could be serving the Eibishter with Kabbalah Soul and yet feel that it's a pleasurable experience, like the person who has mastered their mind and heart, who finds their whole Judaism pleasurable. Matzah shira we could have. But we were not in Mitzrayim already at the point of a full-blown Mashiach experience where there's no possibility of bad, where nothing could become chometz. We're not there yet. Was das kann nicht sein, wenn der Rai ist noch betokve. That's not possible, because the negative was still very much alive in their systems. So on the eve of Pesach, they have the taste of matzah shira, the geschmack of the future of Mashiach, as we could have today in our avodah, but they don't yet have the impossibility of chometz, because they're still negative. Now, that taste of matzah shira was only available while the Jews were still in Egypt. Far the Geula, before they started the process of Geula. But now that they've left Mitzrayim, and now they're working through a different avodah, and of course that's related to the matzah that we'll eat at the Pesach Seder, then that has to be impoverished matzah. That's got to be just flour and water. Why? The Exodus from Egypt achieved this. People who previously were slaves to Paro, the Jewish people, on Zayin Gevaron Avdei Hashem, who were no longer slaves to Paro, now became the Eibishter's slaves, servants. Das heißt, in other words, when you become the Eibishter's servant, you've got to accept Hashem's authority. You've got to accept that the Eibishter is your king. Which is something that is necessary as a precursor to be able to accept Hashem's instructions. First you have to accept Hashem's authority, and then you can accept Hashem's instructions. Like the Gemara Brachas tells us, Mishnah Brachas tells us before about Kriyashma. First you have to accept Hashem's authority, and then you can talk about doing his mitzvahs. And when you're accepting Hashem's authority, when it's the point in your development when you're accepting the Eibishter's authority, there can be no sense of self, because that will dilute and corrupt the whole system. Like the Chazal tell us clearly, if a person standing in front of the king, you wink at a friend, it's a capital offense, God forbid. Und der Pfarrer soll in dem sein, der Tam und Geschmack, soll in dem nicht sein, der Tam und Geschmack von Matzah Shira. Therefore, when you eat that matzah, the matzah of the beginning of your avodah, when you're accepting Hashem's authority, there can't be any flavor, anything that's good for you, that is about you. Because to accept the Eibishter's authority and become the Eibishter's servant, Hashem is not can only be achieved through absolute submission and surrender, and that's actually the avodah that we do every single Pesach when we eat our matzahs, and then of course, hopefully progress to the state of Geula, to the state of Ishapcha, and the Geula b'Pashtus l'matam asar tvachim. Take it from Yad Mamash.